Have you just started cross stitching? Or maybe you're thinking about giving it a go? Well, firstly, yay, because I think it's the most amazing hobby for many reasons, but in a nutshell, it's mindful creativity that you can take with you anywhere. And secondly, I'd like to share some tips that are really the things that I wish I knew when I started out. Hi there, stitchy friends. I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your stitching. So this is going to be a pretty jam-packed video because I have so many tips to share, and I did try to prune the list down, but to be honest, these are all things that, like I said, I really wish I knew right from the get-go. And they're in no particular order, so it's a little bit of a mix of practical tips, but also some mindset tips as well, I guess. So I have 15 tips in total, and a little bonus tip at the end with a fun PDF for you as well. So for several of the tips, I'll be linking to another video that I've made that will dive into that topic in a little bit more depth, because otherwise this video would probably be about 3 hours long. So whenever I do that, I'll link to that video in the description, and I'll link as many as I can in the cards up the top as well, but there is a 5-card limit, so we'll see how many I get to. Okay, let's dive in. So tip number 1 is there are no rules in cross stitch. This is something I feel really passionate about, which is why I say it so often. But there really is no right or wrong way to cross stitch. Despite what you might hear from some cross stitchers that say you must never do it this way or you have to do it this way, I really genuinely believe there is only one way to do cross stitch right, and that's the way that brings you joy to do it. There's a lot of advice and tips out there, so it's really useful to take that all on board, but then discard anything that doesn't work for you. And yes, that includes mine. So tip number 2 is have good light. Now this might seem kind of obvious, but what might seem like good light might not be quite good enough for cross stitch. And it's not good for your eyes to stitch in poor light, but it's also not good for your cross stitch. And I know this because I've gone away from home, stitched in what I thought was okay light, but I've looked at my cross stitch later and thought, yeah, that doesn't look as tidy as it could have done. So at home I have a standard lamp with an LED daylight bulb in it, which is absolutely fantastic. I can angle that over my work and have brilliant light. So if you can get one of those, then definitely go for it. Otherwise, just go for as good amount of light and as bright light as you can. And I recently bought this little LED light that has a clip on the end of it, which is great for taking out of the house with me when I'm travelling, as long as I remember to take it with me. And you can get other solutions as well, such as lights that go around your neck, so it's worth looking at that if you like to take your cross stitch out and about with you. So tip number 3 is to have all the top arms of your cross stitches going in the same direction. And this is probably the easiest thing that you can do to make your cross stitch look really neat and lovely. But it's also not a very obvious thing until you know about it. And I know this because I have one of my earliest cross stitch pieces. It's all framed up on the wall, looks lovely, but yeah, the top arms go in all different directions. Of course I still love it, and it's a good reminder that we all need to learn these things. Let me show you what I mean. So here's a little heart that I stitched with the top arms in random directions. And then I stitched the same heart with them all slanting the same way. And I personally think the one with the top arms all being consistent does look a lot nicer. So this is as close as I will ever come to having a rule in cross stitch. And even then, if making the arms go the same way takes the fun out of it for you, then you don't have to do it. So tip number 4 is count and mark off. Now, no matter how long you've been stitching, I'm pretty sure you never get to a point where you don't make mistakes due to counting errors. If you do, I haven't got there yet. So double and even triple checking can help to reduce that risk. So I have a pattern here that has several individual motifs, so you're going to have to count between the motifs to make sure that you get them in the right place. And one thing that you can do that can really help with this is using multiple points of reference to make sure that you get it in the right spot when you're counting. So let me show you what I mean. So I've stitched these parts here on the flower and the leaves, and I've got the purple thread ready to start with this stitch here. So I reckon the easiest place to count here is across from this stitch. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'll find that spot and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's the corner of this stitch. But what I'm also going to do is make sure that I've got it lined up underneath here as well. So I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and that half stitch. So if I counted from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and that half. So I can see I'm in the right spot both that way and that way on my fabric. And this is where actually it's really useful using the loop method to start, because I've counted from the front and I don't have to take my needle out and find the right hole, that same hole from the back. I can go straight down and come up, and there we go. So now I'm in the right spot for that stitch there. And if you're feeling particularly paranoid, you can count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to that one there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Perfect. And of course, if you want to see more on the loop method, then I have a video on that I've already talked about, so you can go and check that out. Now the other part to this is that it's also really useful to mark off your pattern as you go, so you can mark off exactly what you stitched and what you haven't stitched. And I have a video on this too, so I'll link that one so that you can go and check that out. That will be in a card and in the description for you. Tip number 5 is to keep it clean. And I'm not talking about the theme of your cross-stitch patterns here, because there are some very awesome and naughty cross-stitch patterns out there if that's what you're looking for. I'm talking literally about your hands. They may look clean, but they can still have invisible oils and dirt that can transfer to your fabric as you stitch. And that might not cause any immediate problems, or maybe not even any long-term problems. But it is possible that they could affect the integrity and colours of your thread and your fabric in the long term. So it's really helpful to get in the habit of washing your hands before you sit down to do a stitching session. And of course, you can mitigate this a little bit by washing your cross-stitch piece when you've finished as well. But a belt and braces approach doesn't hurt. Tip number 6 is to wash and iron your cross-stitch piece when you've finished it. Since we were just talking about washing, I thought I would mention this here. And it is also another one that I feel quite strongly about. Because if you've spent hours and hours creating something beautiful, then it's worth taking those few extra minutes just to make it look really top-notch before you finish it. Or if you're me, before you store it in a drawer. And believe me, you can tell the difference. So even if you aren't going to finish up your cross-stitch piece or have it framed immediately, it's still a good idea to wash and press it before you store it away, so that as and when you do want to come to it to do something with it, it's in good condition and not full of creases that are now even more difficult to shift. I am going to be making a video about how to do this fairly shortly, so watch this space, and of course I'll link that in the description as and when that's ready. So tip number 7 is to learn the loop method. And this is a technique for starting your thread that will save you so much time. It absolutely is something that I really wish I'd known earlier how to do, especially from the front of your work as well as from the back. Now I have a video all about this, so go and check that one out, and it will show you just how easy it is to do and what a game changer it is. So tip number 8 is to get organised. It's pretty inevitable as you cross stitch for longer and longer that your stash will grow with threads and fabric and patterns and all sorts. And it's really helpful to find a way to keep all of those organised. Again, that's far too big a topic for me to dive into today. So I just want to give you my one main recommendation if you're starting out. And that's to get a bag to put all of the supplies for each project that you're working on, so you can keep it all together. It can be anything, literally just a plastic bag, a cute pouch. I have these zipper pouches that I love. It's just a matter of keeping it all together so you won't lose anything, it'll keep it clean, and you can take it out and about with you. Now, an additional note here is make sure that you keep your project bags, or whatever you've got your projects in, up out of the way if you have children or pets or anything like that, because I've heard too many stories of projects that got ripped, cut up, eaten, vomited on, and none of that is very nice. So if you have kids or pets, keep your projects out of the way of them. And while we're on the topic of organisation, which you might have worked out is one of my favourite topics, if you're someone who likes to plan your cross-stitch projects and keep track of them, then I also have some planner and tracker sheets that you might like. So I'll pop a little link to those in the description for you as well. Tip number 9 is to buy good quality supplies and equipment. It can be tempting to buy the cheapest supplies that you can find, but in cross-stitch, you generally do get what you pay for. So cheaper threads can be more prone to knotting, cheaper fabric can have bigger, more visible holes or be really horribly stiff and scratchy to work with, cheaper needles may bend and break. So it is worth spending a little bit more on good quality supplies that will make it much nicer to stitch with. And here's a little related bonus tip. When you're starting a project, make sure you buy all the thread that you'll need for it at the start, all in one go, to make sure that you avoid any dye lot changes and the threads not being quite the same colour. If you want to know more about that, then I have a video that I'll link so you can find out more. So tip number 10 is start with the right supplies. So while we're talking supplies, there are 3 basic supplies you need, which is fabric, threads and needle. And I would add embroidery scissors in there too. And choosing the right supplies as a beginner can make your life much easier. Now again, I'm not going to dive into detail on these, but just want to briefly mention each of them. So fabric-wise, there are a lot of gorgeous fabrics available, but some are easier to work with than others, especially for beginners. So I recommend starting with Ada, which is this, not even weave or linen. And I suggest looking for 14 count, which is what this is, not 16 or 18, because the stitches will be bigger, so it's much easier to see what you're doing and get the hang of. Now, if you are really struggling with that, then you could even go to 11 count Ada for even bigger stitches until you're confident, and then move on to 14 count. Now for threads, you can use any, but if you remember what I said earlier about cheap threads, then if you want to save yourself some tangly nonsense, then I recommend DMC threads to start out with. In terms of needles, what you want to look for is tapestry or cross-stitch needles. So these have got blunt rounded tip and perfect for cross-stitch. You don't want a sharp needle. Now they do come in different sizes. I would recommend looking for either a size 26 or a size 24 when you're starting out. But I do have a video on how to choose the perfect needle for you, so go and check that one out. I'll link that in the card and in the description for you. And for scissors, get embroidery scissors. Even a cheap pair will cut your threads so much more cleanly and neatly than whatever scissors you have kicking around in the house. And then save them just for your cross stitch. Don't let anyone else steal them for something else, so that they'll stay nice and sharp. So tip number 11 is read all the instructions first. When you get your pattern or your kit, have a read through of everything, because there is honestly nothing worse than getting halfway through a pattern and realising that you've used the wrong colour, or the wrong number of strands, or you had your fabric the wrong way round. Just saying. Tip number 12 is to untwist your thread as you stitch. If you want to avoid knots and tangles, then this one's a really important one, and that's of course going to make your stitching so much more enjoyable. And I've made a video all about this. I have 3 easy methods that you can use to untwist your thread as you stitch, so go and take a look at that one. So tip number 13 is to start from the middle, at least for your first few projects. There are reasons to start your stitching from some other point like a corner, but it will certainly make life easier to start from the middle, because you won't risk getting the design off centre of your fabric and running out of space to complete it. Now your pattern should have the centre marked in some way, so there's usually arrows, potentially at the top and the side, and you may also have red lines running through so that you can find the centre of your design. And while we're on this subject, I would also suggest when you start, find a nice big block of colour to start with closest to this. So you could start with this heart because it's right in the middle, but it's quite small, so I would probably start with a nice block of brown. That'll give you a good solid block to work from to run your threads in. So tip number 14 is to be careful where you put your needle in the fabric between stitching sessions. So you don't want to leave it parked anywhere that's going to be in an area of fabric that's visible when the stitching is completed. So if, for example, you finish stitching and you leave your needle here, then it can stretch the holes and make them bigger, and that won't look so nice. So what you want to do in between stitching sessions is park your needle out to one side, anywhere around the edge, where it won't matter if it stretches the holes slightly over there. In fact, if you leave your needle in for long enough, then it can actually even leave a rusty mark, so you definitely don't want that. The other thing that can happen if you leave the thread parked with the thread through a hole like this is that some threads can actually discolour the fabric, so you could end up with a slightly coloured mark on your fabric where that thread's been sitting in the hole for so long. So I would recommend avoiding doing that as well. Obviously, if you're going to leave a thread like this and that's somewhere that you're going to be stitching over, then that's not going to be a problem. So tip number 15 is stitch what you love. And yes, I know this might be another fairly obvious thing, but you want to stitch cross-stitch patterns that you're really drawn to and that you're excited to stitch and will give you joy when you sit down for a stitching session. Yes, it's probably ideal to pick smaller patterns if you're a beginner and just starting out, but if the project that you're drawn to is a little bigger or more complicated and you're feeling adventurous, then just go for it, because it's more important that you enjoy what you stitch. And I'm going to say it's totally okay if you get halfway through a project and decide that you don't really want to stitch it anymore. You absolutely can just ditch cross-stitch projects that don't bring you joy. Now, sometimes what happens is that you put that project aside and maybe you go back to it in months or even years and find that you pick it up and are actually enjoying it again, and that's great. But it's also okay if it stays unfinished and you never touch it again. Now, of course, I'm sure there are some of you out there are thinking, no, I absolutely have to finish a project if I've started it, no matter what. And that's fine. If that's you, then yes, if that's what you need to do, absolutely you do that. But to anyone else, I say ditch projects that don't bring you joy. I mean, life is short and there are probably more cross-stitch patterns that you'll want to stitch than you can ever stitch in your lifetime. So I don't think you should waste time stitching things that you don't enjoy. Stitch the ones that you love. Okay, we made it to the end. Yay! Thank you for sticking through all of those tips, and I did say I had one final little bonus tip, and this absolutely isn't essential, but it can be quite helpful, and that's to learn the lingo. Because honestly, cross-stitchers talking, it can sometimes sound a bit like a foreign language. So if you want to learn all the acronyms and terms that are flying around there, then I've created a PDF to list all of those for you, well, as many as I could think of. So go and check that one out. I'll link it in the description for you. And finally, I want to say, please don't worry if the first cross stitches that you make don't look exactly how you wanted them to. We all have to start somewhere. And I'm sure maybe there are some people out there who can pick up a needle and thread and their first cross stitches look absolutely top notch. But that's not how it is for most of us. And even if you've been cross stitching for quite some time, I think we can all learn and improve all the time. For all that cross stitch, on the face of it, is a really simple concept of just making cross stitches on fabric, there are a surprising number of things that can trip you up when you start out. And some of those things you can learn, and I hope my tips will help with that, but a lot of it is just practice. Just getting the feel of it, learning how to get those cross stitches looking neat, how to get the right tension. There's a lot to it, but it will all come with time. The only way to get good at something is by not being very good at it first and practicing lots. Let me know in the comments which tips you found most helpful. Give this video a like, and of course go and watch any of those videos that I've talked about and that I've linked in the description that you think would be helpful for you. And one last thing before I go, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more good stitchy videos, and it will help more people find the videos, and hopefully my tips can help them out too. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching.